We are now on day 9 of our course. As said last time, we have made it halfway through this journey, and now we are entering a very important period of time that we can legitimately call modern philosophy. What are some distinguishing features of this period of modern philosophy as we're moving into it? The Enlightenment itself, maybe even to some extent. And one big difference we start to see in philosophy is we have now an emphasis again, and we say again because it's not the first time in history, but we have a re-emphasis, a renewal of emphasis on the building of philosophical systems. This doesn't apply across the board. Not all philosophers of this time period necessarily have so, but even Gaarder mentions in his book this important detail, this building of systems, this construction of systems of whether it's a metaphysics that then is going to provide the foundation for an epistemology, which will further give rise to an ethics. Maybe you can go back and take a look at that from the very first video, in-depth video, that initial triangle that I posed or proposed that goes against the grain of some philosophers today, but really does seem to incorporate a lot of how older versions of philosophy also seem to work, and the way that it maybe would work best today. But not going to get into that right now. Talking about modern philosophy, these systems, the building of systems, allows for us to start with a clean slate, it seems, over and over in this process. In a really radical way, in a radical sense, not just Descartes, but Descartes as an extremely great example of this going back to first principles. And then overlaying on first principles, either processes of what we call induction, or starting from first principles and assuming X, Y, or Z, deducing certain conclusions, regardless of what methodology, building up a system that is supposed to reflect the world as it truly is from, again, those first principles. It's really another mark of modern philosophy to acknowledge the expansiveness with which individual thinkers since the time of Plato and Aristotle have really just wide-sweepingly recreated an understanding of the conditions for X or Y or Z to exist, or for a philosophical system to be laid down. So let's start with Descartes' ball of wax. I just want to talk about the method for a second, and then we'll actually get at what this serves. But there's this point where Descartes, in his work, is realizing that he needs to shut himself away and get back to first principles, as it were. So he does. He finds this cabin. I can't help but think of the Major's cabin as somehow resembling this place that he found. I believe he was in the Netherlands at the time, and he shut himself away. And for who knows how many days, I don't know actually, he started this line of thinking, and he asked himself these basic questions. When I look at a ball of wax, he says, for instance, and he chooses wax over something else. He could have chosen something like gunpowder or something else. He chooses wax, and I think it was probably an interesting choice to have chosen wax, because if you've ever played with wax, you realize it has some very interesting properties, and he notes these properties. So he says, look, the wax is clearly hard. When I hit it with my finger, it makes a sound. There are all these things about wax. It has certain smells. It still has the aroma of the flowers from which it recently came and all that stuff. But if I bring it closer to the fire, this thing I'm holding in my hand, I bring it closer to the fire, it starts to melt for whatever reason. And I mean, he doesn't need to explicate the reasons. He's more interested in taking what he can from his senses. As a rationalist, we're going to see the senses don't provide enough information, he says. And he watches as the ball of wax melts, and he says, oh my gosh, now it's actually really, a moment ago it was maybe lukewarm, now it's hot. It can no longer be held, and it's turned into a liquid form, and now it's taking the shape of whatever container it's in, and the smell has changed. And then as I take it away from the fire again, it recomposes back into this harder, waxy form, though slightly different as it was before. So what's this? What is he going on about? What's this whole point to going through this process with the ball of wax? The point is that despite how different the melted wax is from this earlier form of hardened, the original form of the ball of wax, it is, in his mind and in the minds of you and me, still wax. It is still, there's still something to it that we can say is either transcendent of or deeper than, depending on which direction you want to go with that. There's something more to it than just what it looks like or what my senses can take in about it. And here alone we get this semblance of an argument for rationalism, that if we were to rely on empiricism or the senses alone, we'd be in trouble. But we will say more about rationalism in a little bit. This is the part of the progression that Descartes makes in this phenomenal realization that if he doubts far enough, he can get to the first principle that he comes to call cogito ergo sum. So how is this different from just a normal form of skepticism? There's something actually fundamentally different between what we've called skepticism and what we will call, in a moment, what we'll call Cartesian skepticism. So skepticism on its own just simply states that if I'm a skeptic, I'm going to say that there's a ground of propositions. And specifically, there's a ground for doubt propositions. What do I mean by that again? Do you recall? Those doubt propositions might be that I can doubt X, Y, or Z. So there's a ground for that, and that cannot be removed, says the skeptic. There's always going to be room for doubt, might be another way that we would put it in more colloquial speak. Notice this is in the realm of epistemology. That's where Descartes is going with this. So, Cartesian skepticism, we can think of as, and we'll read it off here, as a form of skepticism, so we're still in that realm, that denies that we can have knowledge of something without at first eliminating all doubts of it. Hold on a second. This sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Skepticism says there's always room for doubt. Cartesian skepticism says there's always room for doubt until you can get to the barest bones of what is absolutely certain, on top of which then you can start to build back up. And that's what he does. Now, that means that you're still a skeptic. You doubt until you get to the bare bones, until you get to the first principle. His principle being, well, look, he says, I can't maybe trust this body. For all I know, there could be some level of simple illusion. That's the easiest thing for me to doubt, is what it is through the senses. I mean, clearly the ball of wax, I would still call it wax. So I can't trust my senses completely anyway. Let's just remove all about experience and the senses. But then there's still some pretty tough stuff to start doubting. Like, what about the fact that 2 + 2 = 4? What do we start doing with things like arithmetic and mathematics? And as you may already know, Descartes is a very mathematical thinker. He's given birth to analytic geometry. He has ushered in new ways of thinking about algebra. And the Cartesian coordinate system that you use in school, that grid, as it were, of with axes and coordinates, that's called the Cartesian coordinate system, named after Descartes. So, an incredible mathematical mind. But he knows that he has to go deeper. He has to find first principles for even that. So what does he do? He brings in this idea of a sort of demon or god, a deceiving demon or god. He doesn't want to associate it with the actual God that he'll later, feel has certain exists. But more on that in a second. So he brings in this demon that deceives. And the deceiving demon, the deceiving god, as it were, makes it possible for even his reason, his thinking itself, to be compromised. So maybe this deceiving god, if such a thing exists, if such a level of illusory experience of reason itself exists, then we're all deceived in that manner. So, where do we go from there? That seems to be doubting practically everything we possibly can. We have doubted our senses and experience of the things around us, the external as it were, and then even internally, I can no longer trust that my way of reasoning from A to B to C even is legitimate. But there's one thing I cannot doubt, and this is what you've already read in Gaarder, and hopefully we're able to understand the phenomenal, the incredible insight that went into this. Now, he says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. That sounds like just a pithy statement at the moment, but really think it through. The one thing he cannot doubt is the fact that if he can't trust his reasoning, he can't trust that A plus B equals C, he can't trust anything internally in terms of reason and so forth, he cannot doubt that there is something reasoning. He cannot doubt that there is something that is doing this process that he's doing right now. All right, so it's there. He feels then he's come to it. He's come to the ground. He's come to the one clear and distinct idea. And he uses this language frequently, at least in English, we say it this way, clear and distinct. When the idea is clear and distinct, we know we have found certainty. We have found a certainty, and the certainty he has found at the bottommost level, he's taken everything else out. Imagine this, barrel of peaches or something. We go to the farmer's market, and if you look through peaches, you'll find ones with bruises, and sometimes you'll find fruit that's diseased, and he's taken each one out, and he's examining it, and if it's not absolutely clear of anything, any bruises or that, in this case, doubts, then he removes it, and he goes until he gets to the very, very bottom, and then once he's sure that he's removed everything, he can go back through, and the things that he knows are definitely not diseased can go in first. That is, things that have absolutely no doubt, the clear and distinct ideas that build on top of that bottom layer. And then at the top, all the things that at first we were worried about or concerned about can go back on top. And we can continue to debate about them. But for the most part, they are standing now, unlike before, on firm first principles, clear and distinct ideas. A very important aspect of this for him is what is called innatism. Gaarder, I believe, also speaks to this, the innate ideas. He says we come into existence with this reasoning thing, this reasoning capacity that is in essence who I am. Now this is a little bit of a jump, right? To go from this is something that thinks to this is the essence of what I am. But nonetheless, that's where he goes with it. And he says, and one of those things that I come into the world with is the idea that there is a perfect being. I mean, that's something that can't come from experience for certain. We never experience perfection in that sense. So now he's got a reason for God. And now that God is part of the picture again, and this is, as Gaarder points out too, one of those sort of weaker points in the argument, now that God is part of the picture again, he can start to trust more and more the things of his sense experience and so forth. Certainly he can trust reason and mathematics that more than he did before as the faculty that God has brought to us in all his beautiful veracity. That is the full glory of the truthfulness of God. We can rely now on the faculties with which we're provided by God to reason with. And senses and so forth need to be taken with a grain of salt, but we can still work out from reason what those things are. Now here we are. That is full-blown rationalism. We've now gotten to a point where our senses and our experiences can, to some extent, be justified or lack justification based on our ability to reason about them and their causes. And Descartes, again, contributes so much to this. To make it sound like he's just a mathematician or just a, totally in his head kind of guy. He doesn't just, give birth to things like analytic geometry, but he actually helps pave the way for more refined investigations into the nature of light and optics things that perhaps even he wasn't able to publish it right away, unfortunately, after he heard what happened to Galileo in his attempt to, again, promote the ideas of the heliocentric worldview and so forth, and heard what happened to that guy. He kind of held back on the optics stuff for a little bit, and anything having to do with light in astronomy. But, as it were, he was on the right path, and he seems to have perhaps even inspired those later, like Isaac Newton, who would write about this stuff. And while we're here, we need to go on in and now deal with the implications of this. What does this mean? So now Descartes is talking about an extension that is body and a mind, that is the faculty of reason and so forth. There's mind and there's body. And now we have a new philosophical problem at hand, one that we should be proud to be dealing with, in addition to things like the one and the many and others that we've seen in the past. We now have this question of mind and body. Now, I actually think that this is not bare bones enough. If I'm going to be completely honest, I probably fall more in line with the rationalists than the empiricists that we're going to see later on. And with that in mind, I actually feel like there's something missing in the mind-body proposition that contributes to its own problem. But let's go on and state what that is, what the proposition is of mind and body. So if there's a mind and there's, as it were, a body, then what we should be concerned about is how it is that we work within the world with this sort of interiority and this exteriority. How do we function? How do we go about moving about, sensing things, doing things in the world? Is there a junction point for mind and body? Descartes would say, yes, it's the pineal gland. You know, he tried really, and again, due to his now extensive knowledge of anatomy and this, all of this is resurfacing now. They're dissecting bodies. Leonardo da Vinci, it is said, used to actually go into the I don't know if, the morgues, but he would have, I believe, pay people to dig up bodies so that he could then dissect them and learn the anatomy so he could draw better, right? So this is a time period where almost nothing's held back. Let's know our bodies and everything much, much better. Descartes looks at the pineal gland in the brain, and he says this is the most likely entry point, or the most likely, I should say, communication point between this one substance, we'll call it mind, and this other substance, we'll call it extension or body. And now they're talking to each other. Perhaps the most firm, current day, contemporary proponent of this sort of mind-body dualism is a very famous philosopher named David Chalmers. So perhaps at some point you should look into him. But a lot of people will otherwise critique this view. So one view of this is the homunculus problem. It's not really synonymous with ghost in the machine, but they kind of come to the same idea, which is that if the ghost in the machine is the idea that there's a spiritual or a non-physical whatever, and it occupies some sort of conductor position or directing position inside of the physical thing, which is the body. And how does that work? How is that going to actually function? And again, maybe the pineal gland probably not being the best explanation. How does a ghost operate a physical machine? The ghost in the machine is a common way of at least referring to the problem, if not the critique itself. Homunculus is an actual logical description of this that gets at sort of the same kind of critique. How can this possibly work? And it works by infinite regress. That wonderful tool. We keep coming back to that, don't we? Infinite regress. Well, Descartes was saying that I think, therefore I am. This is my essence. This is my essence, is this reasoning, thinking thing, this mind. Well, if that's the case, then we could ask, is there then another thing behind that? That is there something that operates, if there's an actual operator inside of me that works within the world of this body, is there something inside of that then operates the second me, or I should say the primary me, the first me? And then if there's another little guy inside of there who controls that guy, then wouldn't that continue on and on and on and on, where each time we think we have this version of me, we find that there's some other version of me that operates from behind the scenes, that exterior form. And so we're like an internal, it's an infinite regress, but it's an infinite regress into the internal. Another quick thing we should touch on before moving on to the next rationalist is, what does this mean about the forms? Well, as in when we were talking about it, up to this point, substance and forms, these were still very important concepts throughout scholasticism leading up into the Enlightenment period. And Descartes does something really radical here. He doesn't wish to directly oppose the scholastics. Scholastic philosophy is still not completely gone yet at this time period, these 1500s, 1600s. And so he doesn't want to outright say, I'm in opposition to the Aristotelianism that these scholastics are talking about with their forms and so forth, but nonetheless, he really kind of is. He's saying through the Meditations, which he considers his groundwork for all other physics and philosophy from this point forward, at least his own, if not everyone's. He says that the forms need to be replaced with something else, that this idea of substance with forms is unnecessary. He wants to mathematize philosophy. He says, rather than thinking of forms as anything other than quantities, that is truly numbers, that this whole idea of there being these formal causes or forms that somehow also, substance without form, he thinks of as being rather ridiculous at this point. Everything really is about substance and quantity. And now we can use mathematics as a very generous tool by which we can understand and facilitate our understanding of these substances. And this ends up playing a really important role for Spinoza as well, and later rationalists. But before we get to that, I have to take a quick moment as we're moving into talking about Spinoza, talk about the other side of this mechanistic worldview. What Descartes is essentially saying is that, yes, there's like a mind governing thing, but that's the only thing that has really free will. Everything else works like a clock. Everything works in this mechanistic way. Our body or extension, things that, the thing that makes us different perhaps from other things, he didn't want to say necessarily that animals don't have mind. There's just no way to legitimize that perspective. We don't have a way of confirming that. So to all extents and purposes of our own, there's really nothing but automata out there. And the automaton being, again, that unit of whatever that moves around as if it has some sort of internal governor or something that is controlling it from the inside, when in fact it's completely determined, as it were, by outside forces and just doing what it does. A clock, the gears, if each gear wasn't turned by another gear, which in itself was also determined in the potential energy that is increased by winding it up, and it's just now releasing the energy in this form, pushing the gears, making the clock move. It's all this physical external development that works by no governing mechanism innately to itself. Mind is the only thing that can do that for Descartes. There's another side to this mechanistic worldview, though, that is complete materialism. This is the way of Hobbes, and while Gaarder covered Hobbes actually in prior chapters, I skipped over him in the last one because he's going to occupy an important position here against the rationalists. In a way, he should almost be considered among the empiricists that come up later, but that dichotomy between the rationalists and the empiricists usually doesn't include Hobbes for whatever reason. But Thomas Hobbes was extremely influential. He did more for the English language than we care to sometimes mention, an extremely important thinker and writer in the way of politics after writing the Leviathan and so forth. I won't really go and give his full story, but here's the thing that matters here. In this mechanistic worldview, we again encounter materialism and an absolute form of materialism. We see that in the senses and in experience, Hobbes feels there's nothing else to derive our premises or conclusions for reason. We have to have experience. We have to have senses. Nothing could be farther than the truth for him than to think that reason is somehow a capacity that we have that operates regardless of what our senses and experience tell us. That reason is nothing more than when we reason something out, we're either adding or we're subtracting things. And while this sounds a little like Descartes' mathematicism, it's different. The addition of, if I give reasons, the addition of those things still require reasons that are based on what I've experienced or seen in the actual world. Empirical data and all that aside for a moment, these experiences inform me what the reason is. And when I add those reasons together, I come up with some conclusion. But that conclusion didn't come about by way of some transcendental process. It came about by the addition of these. So now we can talk about Spinoza. Spinoza really is a diehard rationalist, but he comes at it from a slightly different approach. While he has a much better affiliation with Descartes than, say, with Hobbes, he's actually trying to create a bridge between the two of them, create the common ground that he feels they both share. So you have Descartes' system that's based on his rationalism, and as we were saying, his innate ideas, his innatism. And that rationalism gave birth to a dualism for Descartes, this mind and body. And then we have Hobbes and his system, which is an alternative to Descartes for many people, the materialist side of things, where you can rely on empiricism and empirical, on experience and empirical notions to ultimately understand it's really just a materialistic world, a mechanistic worldview in both cases, but one is prevalently based in the material of the world and not some separate mind that Descartes has brought in. And how does Spinoza manage to do this? Well, one thing we didn't say about Descartes is that he believes in a sort of finitism. Maybe this is why it was not Descartes who ended up giving birth to calculus, which we'll give credit to someone else in just a moment. But Descartes believes that there's a finitism to the world, a sort of finitude. Things are not infinitely, we aren't capable of infinite understanding because the universe itself is not an infinite thing. We are finite, and in this way, again, God being a separate being from us, our finitude or finiteness is, if anything, logically derivable from the fact that if there's anything that is infinite, it's not the material world, it's not us by way of extension and so forth, it must be God. And in a sort of almost Platonic way, maybe reason partakes in God, if only because God gives us the faculty for reason. But it does not allow for us to conceptualize an infiniteness in us, in nature, because to do so would be treading on God's turf, as it were. If you remember back to the pantheism argument, that was exactly what gave birth to that pantheism, was the idea that if God were infinite, then it would we could presume that he or she would include the natural world. After all, it would include everything, wouldn't it, in its infinity? Well, the opposite here is why Descartes doesn't like this idea, why he sticks with traditional theism, as it were, because he's saying that if we were infinite, then we would have to extend into God, as it were, and that's just not a thing. So what if that were a thing? And this is where Spinoza comes in. Spinoza is, we can say legitimately, a sort of pantheist, as was becoming more prominent at this time. And so he reads Descartes, and he loves this, he's enjoying this dichotomy, more or less, between the sort of innate or intrinsic and this extension. This dichotomy between the two works perfectly well for him, except that he does not see them as being separate substances. He says Descartes doesn't go far enough here, that he needs to realize there's something deeper at work here on the matter concerning God. One thing that I don't think Gaarder explains very well is, why is Spinoza, by the way, dealing with these Christian versions of texts and not just the Jewish ones? He's a Jew, isn't he? He's actually part of a group of Jews that were forced at this time and period to convert to Catholicism. And so it was very important that they were steeped in the teachings of Christianity as well. Furthermore, it was not that uncommon for these Sephardic Jews to be excommunicated from time to time. It was a really tumultuous time and location for them. And so the fact that Spinoza was excommunicated for his views is not that remarkable a phenomenon as it's sometimes made out to be, including by Gaarder. It doesn't seem that remarkable to me anyway. But what is pretty remarkable is what this all leads up to for him in his both his critique of Descartes and his acceptance of tenets from Descartes' philosophy, and how it is that he wants to try and address this feud between Hobbes and Descartes. He wants to address this pure materialism that Hobbes speaks to against Descartes' dualism of mind and body. And he says it like this, as a pantheist: we are aspects of God. He comes up with what he calls, or what we can call, a dual aspect theory. He says there's mind and there's body. There is extension and there's the intrinsic world, the innate world. And these two worlds are two aspects of one thing. He's moving from dualism to now a monism, that really all is one. All is nature, all is God. There's nothing separate in that. And when we think that we're seeing a fine division, as Descartes does, between mind, this pure reason and so forth, and the external world, what we're really doing is just recognizing the only two aspects that humans are capable of understanding or coming into contact with by experience and reason. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other aspects. In fact, there's every reason in God's infinitude, in the infinity that is God/nature, to believe that there are an infinite number of aspects of God that we simply don't have access to as human beings. This maybe is what makes Spinoza so popular with many people of today, or many scientists, including Einstein himself, who gave a lot of his dedicated time and resources to understanding Spinoza and reading his philosophy. It was apparently very inspirational for him. Anyone who says that philosophy does not somehow partake in the ways of science today may not be very familiar with how the greatest thinkers in science of late have actually held very deep relationships with philosophy. Now, going into Spinoza is a whole treatise in itself, as it would be with Descartes as well. So let's keep it simple to here, which is that his rationalism is clear in the sense that he sees a sort of mathematization of philosophy as useful. He goes down the sort of geometric route where, if you've ever seen a geometric proof, they have often in geometry classes today continued to show geometry proofs as a way of doing true geometry. So as a very short example, you've seen this, I'm sure, before in geometry class. So we have two lines here, and let's say that we have a given statement such as that this point here, C, is the midpoint of both AE and of BD. The midpoint, it's right in the middle of both of those two line segments. Can we derive conclusively that these two triangles are similar? That is, that other than perhaps their relative size, they are the same triangle. And most of the time in these geometric proofs, you lay down these axioms. That is, axioms such as, well, when triangles share a side and an angle and another side, that provides itself a proof that they are similar. And you derived that axiom from earlier axioms. So axioms giving way to postulates, giving way to ways of solving problems like this deductively. What Spinoza wants to do, and we can say does, but perhaps not completely successfully, is he wants to derive first a metaphysics, an ontology, based on these geometric principles, and from that he actually moves through the realm of metaphysics to epistemology and later to ethics. Later, in other words, a geometrical proposal for ethics. That sounds absurd, doesn't it? How do you derive from first principles like this what human beings are supposed to do or not do? And the fact that he actually builds it in this way perfectly illustrates the way, the triangle I mentioned before, the way that we are capable of thinking of the relationship between these different branches of philosophy. Now, I'd love to go into the details of this, but I'm going to leave that mostly to you to explore at later times. Go look up his work, his ethics, specifically, and read through that and note, yes, the density, in a way, the density, the difficulty of reading it axiom by axiom, then building on top of those to get somewhere, but you get the flavor of what this other way of doing rationalism looks like. And so if we live in an infinite universe, and indeed there is a pantheistic universe, God is nature, nature is God, call this a form, you could do this even from an atheist perspective, you could just call it all nature, then we would be merely witnessing or observing different aspects of what it's like to be part of this fundamental reality. And so there's no actual critical difference, as it were, substantially, literally by way of substance, there's no difference between an external and an internal world, a mind and body. So does this solve the mind-body problem? Well, many would say no, otherwise David Chalmers would be out of a job. But this does connect us to that wonderful common ground that all rationalists essentially share, which is that there are things that are inherently knowable or intuitive, or in some way or other immediately graspable conceptually due to our rational nature. In the case of, say, Spinoza, the aspect of nature or God that we think of as mind, in that same way, shares in that sort of perfect conceptualization of God, that is, God's ability to conceptualize, or nature having in it maybe a perfect characterization or reflection of the full universe, and we can capture that to some extent. But one thing I want to take a moment to do is touch on somebody that Gaarder does, I think, a big injustice to, and that is Leibniz. Leibniz here, Gottfried Leibniz, was mentioned a couple of chapters back, and it was some strange mention of spirituality versus the material. I want to take a moment. Leibniz is far, far, far more important than it has been given credit to by Gaarder. Leibniz, on the one hand, at the same time as Newton, he gives birth to calculus. And it is, in fact, Leibniz's symbolism for it, the way that we actually write calculus out. We use his marks. We use his symbols for calculus, not Newton's. So while they were both really important developers of the concepts of calculus, Leibniz is often underrated, or at least given a lot less observance for what he conceptualized, both in mathematics and in philosophy. Part of the reason might be that he's a philosopher who doesn't fit very well into that paradigm that I mentioned a moment ago of the systems building type of philosopher. In fact, his thought seems to change sometimes altogether over time about different subjects. So if only for this reason, maybe it's really hard to pin Leibniz down for what he is or what he represents. Nonetheless, I'm going to try anyway because I think it's really important. This is a sculpture that's outside of the Lyon, is what I'll say, Lyon Samsung Museum of Art. I believe this one is in Korea, but I believe there are, I think, different reproductions of this sculpture. I love this sculpture, and I love using it as a way of thinking about Leibniz's monadology. The monad is the indivisible essence of something. And one way we can think about it as every soul, every human soul is a monad. The question is, does that only pertain to humans, or if everything is essentially a monad, does everything have a soul? Leibniz would probably say no, but it does bring up an interesting point. If we were to not be as anthropocentric as we are, would we grant everything that exists a soul? If at the basis of it all, the essence is a monad. What is a monad? A monad for him is a substance. So this is a radical turn, isn't it? We went from Descartes exacting two specific substances, mind and body, to Spinoza saying, no, it's all really just one, this one substance that is essentially God/nature, that everything else is modes or aspects of. Now we have Leibniz, and it would seem a massive, if not an infinite number, then a massive number of essences, substances, a plurality, a pluralism. This is the typical lingo that we use in metaphysics to talk about the number of substances, those of us at least who still talk about substances anymore in the universe. And we can see that when there's one, there's monism. When there's two, there's dualism. Fair enough. Anything above two, we typically label a pluralism. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing Leibniz come in and say, well, you have assumed that there are interactions between these different things in the world that we not only experience but can reason about. While it seems maybe clear to us that there are interactions, we can never actually necessitate that as being the case. We cannot be certain that that is the case, that necessarily. In other words, he wants to bring formalism back into the picture in part. He wants to say that there are substantial forms, and they're not limited per se in number. They would be for all things, everything you can possibly imagine. This is a mind bender if you think about it. So for Leibniz, these are only natural things. He'd say if you were to clunk, two diamonds together and glue them together, that would not be one new thing. There's no reason to be bound to this, though. Why not? Why not artificial things as well as natural things? Why not aggregates of things also as things in themselves? After all, remember Galileo's experiment. That's how he discovered the contradiction in Aristotle pertaining to gravity, when we conceptualized the two tied objects together as one object in itself as well. Why not include aggregates of objects? So nonetheless, if we stick with Leibniz, the point here is that all these things have souls in a sense, or are comprised of monads. This is a really difficult thing to get our brains around, perhaps, but it's really worth going to this extreme end to talk about the substance pluralism that also existed at this time that is often undervalued. And two of the most interesting things to say about these monads is that they also each contain a perspective. No two are identical. This is one of the important principles here, that you can't have two self-same things without being literally the same thing. So they can't be identical except within themselves as having an identity. That's one thing. But they also each contain their own perspective of the universe for that same reason, at the same time paradoxically containing the entire timeline and relations with all other things in the universe, which kind of makes it a borderline holism. We'll talk about that more at another point. But it allows for these things to be completely separate substances. That's the whole idea. Part of what makes Descartes easier to nail is if these are two separate substances, mind and body. Substance, by definition, means they would have no direct relations to one another, so the idea they'd communicate to each other through a pineal gland doesn't make sense. Leibniz takes this to the farthest extent and says these things don't connect. They don't communicate with one another. They don't need to. They have a pre-established harmony, he says. That, like the clock, imagine, though, that the clock instead works not by gears literally pushing and communicating with each other and turning it, but maybe that's all something of an illusion. That instead, if I were to put all the gears and let's say that I put them on these little pegs and then I were to rotate them all at the same time. Let's say I just had water splash down, and that's creation, and now all the gears are turning, and it would seem that that's what's causing the hands on the clock to move, when in fact it's just the placement of, it's just the creation itself, the harmony that I created among all the gears and the hands of the clock by the rushing water, causing those things to start spinning and moving. He's saying that each of these monads don't need to communicate, that everything, as it were, not even so much deterministically, you could say, but predeterministically moves through time as doing what it does. The fan turns, I move my hands, the light shines, but all in a coordinated, it's like a performance on theater, for another analogy, a performance in theater where everything is pre-choreographed. You aren't actually, when it looks like two dancers are causing the other to do something, what's really going on is it was already planned from the beginning that they would do that thing, that they would make this particular motion. This one would make this motion, this one would make the other motion. And it's not being caused by one or the other. They're staying in harmony, and it's been pre-established, it's been pre-choreographed to look that way. Fascinating stuff. Leibniz did so much more than this. He established the principle of sufficient reason, which says, in essence, that any fact that you take to be a fact has to have a reason for it, and we assume that to be the case most of the time. But in philosophy, sometimes you have to go to the farthest extent with that too, and say any fact that we take for granted, we need to discover the reason for it in order to be more certain of its foundations. And so now we get to the innate idea, which, if we go back again to Descartes, is what's going to finally be responded to by the empiricists. And in order to do so, we're going to have to distinguish between what are called primary and secondary qualities, which will become even clearer as we move further into the empiricists past Locke. Let's talk about Locke. So Locke's big deal against Descartes' innate idea proposition is, as Gaarder says, he goes back to Aristotle and asks, how could any idea come about were there not an impetus for it first? That there is nothing that in the mind belongs in the mind that did not first come about by way of the senses and experience. He develops this idea called the tabula rasa. Steven Pinker is a great modern psychologist / you could say kind of psychological philosopher who has taken tabula rasa and taken it to new levels. So look up Steven Pinker if you get a chance. Tabula rasa is just a blank slate. The idea is that we're born being completely blank, just like this whiteboard, right? And then what happens is we go about the world as little babies, and we start to get more and more refined ideas of what we're looking at, so that you have this, what was going to be a dog, which is now a who knows what, an animal of some sort, and a ball, and then we start picking up on the fact that if we put 2 of these, and 3 of these, and 4 of these together, that we can actually count those, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can do the same with animals, and I can do the same with pencils, and then I can just move into abstract numbers and so forth. Now we're getting at ideas, none of which were innate, none of which came first from the mind itself, but were built upon over a long period of time. Simple ideas coming together and creating complex ideas, he says. And so if ideas aren't, for Locke, innate by way of the definition of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that is an idea whose contents have their origin in nature or in our nature by way of thinking or the thinking thing. How do we go about talking about the world the way we do? I mean, obviously, if it's all just empirical and experiential, how can we agree on the same things? After all, not just beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but we all have different perspectives and experiences of the world. So should we assume it to be the case that if I guess a ball to be, a few pounds, 5 pounds, or something like that, that you over there would experience it differently? That maybe you'd experience it and estimate it to be, 2 pounds or 200 pounds. As Gaarder brings up, that's not how the world works. And this is what Locke starts to explicate more refinedly. He says, look, we have primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities are things that we can, in a sense, measure and come to agreement on exactly. They're the objective agreements of things that we can make of our measurements and so forth. But then the sort of empirical experience and empirical information that has to do with, of course, things like color, things like smell even, things that you cannot readily just put a quantitative number to. Again, going against the grain of Descartes and his let's quantify everything and forget about form other than in the sense of quantity. He's saying that no, there are qualities, and that your quantities are pertaining to the primary qualities specifically. You can give numbers to weight. You can give numbers even to motion, as it were. This was back when motion was considered mostly an absolute thing, that if I'm standing still, it would seem, even though in reality we know that I'm flying, depending on what my reference is, my frame of reference, one could say I'm flying at millions of miles per hour through space, if we take into context the entirety of the Earth and the solar system. So this was just pertaining mostly to absolute references to motion. But that this too is a primary quality. We can measure that, we can calculate that, we can predict that, even to some extent in this somewhat mechanistic worldview. But we can't always agree on the secondary qualities. And for that reason, the fact that so many of the secondary qualities inform us of the primary qualities, or that is of the things that, you have the dog and you have the number and so forth, we can say a primary quality of this is that there are 4 balls and only 4 balls. But I, of course, use secondary qualities to first discern what the ball is and so forth. This ends up being a very, very, very important part of the argument of Berkeley. When we speak next time on Berkeley, who's sort of the pivotal figure in Gaarder's book here. This almost sort of Achilles heel to Locke, an open door that Berkeley is going to burst through and take over in his version of empiricism. More on that next time. And so we need primary and secondary qualities to describe the world. Some people even today tend to characterize the brain as being, left hemisphere being the more rational, more quantitatively attentive part of our brain, and the right hemisphere being the more creative, artistic, color sensitive part of the brain. It's an oversimplification, as you can probably guess, but it is an interesting way of thinking about it, is that maybe one seems to correlate more highly with these primary qualities of Locke, and the other correlate more strongly with the secondary qualities. And so at any given time, you could look at something like this picture here of squares and ovals, and you can ask, well, what are the primary and secondary qualities in here? We would say the primary qualities must regard their shape. There's no way I can, given or minus any intentional optical illusions here, there's no way I'm going to mistake those squares for circles. And I'm unlikely to mistake the ovals for circles, or as being anything other than a sort of flattened circle, but certainly not a perfectly round one. That there is the background, which maybe comprises one big gray square. There's the foreground, which comprises 4 squares of different colors, perhaps, but we'll even debate that in a second. And then we have these 4 ovals, one for each of the 4 squares. So secondary qualities. A very fun spin to this will be, let's just taking color again for the moment, because color is the only thing that's really available to us as a secondary quality from this picture. What if I were colorblind? So everything that we've said up to this point about there being squares and ovals, and how many ovals there are to how many squares, how many of each of those shapes there are total, we'd be in complete agreement about that. But as soon as someone said, but there are different colors among these 4, there's red, green, yellow, and purple. Now, I may not deny the fact that for somebody else there's going to be those 4 colors, but I am certainly not going to agree with you right off the bat without further information that there are 4, potentially 5 if you include the gray, that there are 4 or 5 different colors. I am going to actually maybe not even see the ovals to begin with, I believe that in colorblindness I might have difficulty telling any difference between green and red, which would make the two ovals at the top mostly disappear. So there's two things at play here. On the one hand, we can see Locke's qualities in action. We can see that there are ways of being in the world, whether I'm a colorblind human being or a dog or even a human baby, which is apparently colorblind at birth. I'm going to experience the world in different ways, and we can disagree on which of those ways is more right, but ultimately it's based on the relation I have to the things that I'm experiencing, not the things themselves, which will become a really important thing to get back to later. Very soon we're going to talk about Immanuel Kant, and that thing in itself is going to be the critical piece to how we move forward in thinking about things in philosophy. But then we should by now start to be sensitive to a gap in reasoning. There's something here. Why would the ovals disappear? That would mean that maybe primary qualities are not altogether possible of being agreed on or interpretable if you can't judge them by the secondary qualities by which we actually perceive them in the first place. We're going to see next week. This is where everything turns around when it comes to Berkeley. The last thing that I don't want to pass up while we're here on Locke is just how incredibly influential all these philosophers were. But in the realm of politics in particular, in this country, one thing I am genuinely proud of is, in being an American, the sort of grants to natural rights and freedoms that this country has operated on since its inception. And while there's been a lot of disagreement as to whom those freedoms and rights were being granted, nonetheless, the fact that we've come to a point where being an American, at least I think, by definition, means granting rights and freedoms to all individuals as human beings, as people. And perhaps we'll be the ones to really push the envelope and say, why not plants and animals and so forth as well? Can we reconceptualize the way we think about rights? The person we have to thank for that is Locke. Locke, who said, look, if these natural laws, as it were, these ways or principles by which physics work in nature, would seem to me to also stem into ethics, if only by way of what these physical bodies and the souls that they maybe encompass also should be granted natural rights. They're natural in the sense that they derive straight from nature, from the world around us, and therefore they are not anything that someone can give or can grant or take away from you. This is very different from how sometimes we talk about them today. A natural right is not something that someone can take away from you or give you. It's something you have. You have it inherently as part of being a human being in the world, as part of existing in this universe as a human being. And the only thing that people can do is attempt to infringe on them, is attempt to deny you those rights. But if only by way of how the United States operates, also has influenced concepts of democracy and our ideas of what's right and wrong throughout the rest of the world as well. And that concludes this piece on modern philosophy, although we are far from being done. Next time we'll be going into the rest of the empiricists and spending a particularly great amount of detail on Berkeley and how that pertains to idealism as it also exists today. See you then.